When choosing which fish to breed and in what order, I aim for a pattern. In a group of related species, I like to start with something common, and that usually implies that it's on the easier side in terms of breeding difficulty. If it goes well, I try to move forward incrementally to less common and presumably more difficult species. Of Corydoras, I most recently talked about pandas, and during that same weekend I started actively trying to spawn these gold lasers. I'm always excited to start with a new fish, but more than anything, I was curious to find out why they're so expensive. So let's find out. I got a group of 8 young adults, and then fed them well and let them grow for a while before attempting to trigger a spawn. These in particular I had for 8 or 9 months before they spawned, and I think that's very important. If you got some a month ago and you're wondering why they won't breed, to me that's no mystery. They really need time to reach sexual maturity. To my eyes, I see 3 females and 5 males in this group, which I always judge by size and shape. By the time they're mature enough to breed, female Corydoras should be noticeably larger and broader, especially on the underside where, if they're fed well, they can hold a bomber bay full of eggs. This female in particular is an almost hyperbolic example. She's a monster, and probably the best example of size disparity I've seen so far. I know I have 8 fish, but by the size on this one, you'd think I started with 9. I had the tank set up exactly as I did for the pandas. A big plant, some shelters, and a spawning mop placed in the direction of water flow from my filtration. You might see some things move around, but that's just to make filming easier. One difference I noticed with these gold lasers is that despite being tank raised, they've been the most skittish and camera shy corys I've ever worked with. I had to get creative to keep them from hiding in the back of the tank. In preparation for their first spawns, I focused on feeding and water changes. Given primarily dry foods until now, I switched to frozen bloodworms, freeze-dried tubifex, and extra brine shrimp. All good sources of protein and fat to help with egg production. Volume is important too. If I want to get spawns, I feed a lot, and as often as I can manage. Not enough to be dangerous, but enough to keep Jaws over here happy. I also do a lot of water changes. Not just to keep up with the heavy feeding, but to capitalize on the relationship between Corydoras and the heavy rainfall that brings on their breeding season. I keep this tank at 77 degrees, and while encouraging spawns, I'm adding water that's a few degrees lower. I'm not certain that's critical, but I've found fresh flowing water to be consistently helpful. If I want to catch them spawning on a Saturday, for example, I do water changes Thursday and Friday. It becomes very predictable. One more note on the water. This was all at a pH around 7.9 with moderate mineral hardness. I would prefer the water be much softer, but it does demonstrate that with tank-bred adults, they aren't very demanding. So I fed the food, I changed the water, it's Saturday morning, and there they go. As we've seen in other species, their spawning behavior is energetic if not frantic. The whole group moves up and down the tank walls as the males chase and swirl around the females, competing for their attention. Periodically, a male whispers just the right sweet nothings to coax a female into the T position. Here the male releases milt to fertilize 1 or more eggs, now clamped between the fins on the underside of the female. I've spent more time than a grown man should trying to figure out how this works mechanically, and I'll probably never know. One way or another, it works. Afterward, the female takes off looking for a place to deposit the eggs. You can see this one carrying what looks like 3 eggs between her ventral fins. This is another difference I noticed from the species I've bred before. I'm used to seeing 1, maybe 2 eggs at a time, but for the gold lasers, 3 or 4 seem to be the average. Fortunately, they seem to have the same preference for placing their eggs in the direction of water flow. While some were left on the underside of a leaf, the vast majority ended up on or directly behind the spawning mop. They went on spawning for a long time, most of the day really, and that evening I removed the eggs to hatch somewhere safe. I carefully removed the eggs from the plant, a number from the tank glass, and then the spawning mop. In this case, I moved the eggs directly into a breeding box. Usually I hatch cory eggs in a specimen container with some kind of antifungal additive, and that's worked very well for me. This time, though, I wanted to try something different. No additives, I would just spread the eggs out and circulate clean water through the box. I have to emphasize, not circulating within the box, but through it. In a specimen container with an airline, I don't think this would work very well. That would just be marinating the eggs in fungus. It took about 4 days for the eggs to hatch, and during that time I was pretty pleased with what I saw. The infertile eggs developed some fungus quickly, but it didn't really seem to spread. Some of the clumps where multiple eggs adhered to each other did get a little coverage, but nothing worrisome. This is the night before they started hatching, and if you watch close you can see a few fry moving around and planning their escape. In the morning, I found the first fry to break loose, and then the rest followed throughout that day and the following morning. Periodically, I removed the empty shell casings and any remaining infertile eggs. As I was doing that, I watched closely for any fertile eggs that had been covered by fungus and likely wouldn't hatch. I think I counted 2. Measured against the 80-something that did hatch, I'm perfectly happy with those results. In my experience, this was as good a hatch rate as I've ever had. All this is to say, with some rather expensive fry on the line, you can get by just fine without antifungals. I didn't feed the fry immediately. Instead, I let them absorb the rest of their egg sacs. Usually after about 36 hours, I see that their bodies have narrowed and their heads and mouths have widened. That's my cue to start feeding. Like I mentioned with the pandas, I like to start off with a very small food, and that's usually a fry powder. I mix a small amount with water using a pipette, and this time I thought I'd show you what that looks like. This is to break up clumps and make sure that it sinks. Once it's mixed, I try to gently release it around the fry, as low as I can so it doesn't just blow around in the water. If I'm feeling lazy, which sometimes I am, I'll just get some on my finger and dunk it into the water. It gets the job done, but it is a bit messier. I also like to keep the lights low or off in the early days so that the fry feels safe to move around and find food. After at least one day of fry powder, I switch to baby brine shrimp. This is the power food. I feed in the same way by getting some in a pipette and releasing them near the fry. I like to come back later and make sure that everyone was able to eat. And when I do, I look for those off-center patches of orange inside the fry to confirm that they were able to eat the brine shrimp. If I see any without it, and it's been long enough that they would have eaten, I might add a little more fry powder in case they still want something smaller. It's rare though, and to me it's usually an early sign that that fry won't do well long term. I usually stick with brine shrimp until the fry are much larger. I'll show you some of that progression. This is towards the end of that first week. Their shape hasn't changed much, but they're 2 or 3 times larger. Now, a couple of weeks later, they're much more developed. Still a bit odd looking from above, but at this point they're pretty durable. All this time I'm still feeding brine shrimp at least twice a day and making sure their water stays clean. Here they're a little over a month old, and I'm trying out a dry food for the first time since eating a powder in the beginning. As you can see, they're going right for it. I've been asked a few times about transitioning from live to dry food, and usually it's not really a difficult thing as long as the dry food is appetizing. This one is krill-based, and it's very appealing to them, but if you open a fish food and it smells like hay or grain, that might be a tougher sell. What I was checking for was that they had grown enough to eat the same food I'm giving to an earlier batch of juveniles. At this size, they had more than outgrown a breeding box, so I released them into a tank where they could join the rest of the herd. And this too is bursting at the seams. I'm overrun with these things. I cleared out a larger tank recently where these will be going next, and Jaws is going on a diet. Still, I wanted to show how prolific these fish are because it speaks to my initial question. Why are they so expensive? My conclusion is, I have no idea. If I had to guess, I would say they aren't really a well-known fish, and demand is actually low. My mind associates low demand with lower prices, but in reality, as long as there's any demand and a controlled supply, the price goes back to the maximum amount we're willing to pay for them. The good news is, if you want to breed these yourself, I don't think you'll find it difficult. Just give them time, take good care of them, and they'll create for you the same crisis they have for me. And I think that's it. I'll call it there. And as for the next breeding video, I'm very happy to say it'll be a Pistogramma elizabethae. So as usual, thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.